我試下嗰啲聲音得唔得先？等下testing testing， 睇下嗰啲乜嘢啊？麥克風得唔得先？麥克風，我嘅 channel live。喂，麥克風冇就得啊，就睇下個喇叭燈有冇聲先。願你無廝守一生的決心，請不要愛上我這麼一個人，在你字典中一句廢之真去，對我已過分。我承認都是誓言惹的禍，偏偏似糖如蜜水最動人，再怎麼心如鋼鐵也成繞指柔。得啦，我 test 好啦，我呢個咧有時就做如果你睇嗰陣時咧，就大致上嚟講咧，就同話咗俾我知啊，就我呢個一路做功課一路就做 live 嘅，咪就做直播嘅，就我係我啱啱發現咧，我嘅支持嘅隊伍拎唔到第一名啦，就發覺拎唔到第一名啦，就睇下第三名拎唔拎到啦，就唔知睇下聽日咧就英國同阿根廷嘅歷史嘅仇恨，就邊個贏啦嚇？就希望大家都唔好發脾氣。就點解我話邊個嘅乜嘢？就點解我話邊個嘅？呢啲係歷史嚟嘅，就我自己都唔100%肯定係阿根廷咧，係200年前咧係英國殖民地嚟嘅，就俾你睇下點解我就炒到呢啲嘢啦，就我好想咧，好似美國同埋斯朗咁，同埋俄羅斯同埋俄國同埋乜嘢啊？就烏克蘭咧嗰啲仇恨，拎嗰啲世界盃嚟，拎世界盃嚟整落仇恨嗰度嘅，就世界盃上邊咧拎鬥下邊個強啲咯。就一個人得，好似英格蘭對阿根廷咁，就我而家俾你哋睇下嗰啲歷史先，就遲啲同你傾，咪就真係 同你傾下，咪就睇下我嘅我就會講下英格蘭嘅情況，兼加上我嘅相，咪就到36強嘅英格蘭所拍啦。
Just after 11 p.m. on the evening of April 1st, 1982, a group of Argentinian Marines stepped out of rubber boats onto the Falkland Islands, an isolated and windswept archipelago in the South Atlantic, controlled by the United Kingdom. After decades of failed negotiations and months of preparation, the reconquest of what they called Las Malvinas was underway. It was the start of a 10-week war that would end with hundreds of casualties, controversy, and profound effects on both Britain and Argentina. The Falklands War had begun. At the heart of the events of 1982 was a complicated territorial dispute over the Falklands that went back centuries. Its intricacies are not the subject of this series or this video, but it's worth going over the basics. The Falkland Islands were first claimed by the English, first settled by the French, and first governed by the Spanish. When Argentina gained its independence from the Spanish Empire shortly after the turn of the 19th century, it considered that Las Malvinas was an integral part of its colonial inheritance. Britain disputed this and ended up sending ships to assert control over the islands in 1833. The Falklands became a crown colony in 1840 and grew into an important coaling station for Royal Navy ships operating in the South Atlantic. The dispute over the island's sovereignty simmered away until Argentina approached the UN in the 1960s for help with realising its claim, citing the continuing British control of the islands as an example of colonialism. Britain agreed to take part in talks but proved reluctant to allow any transfer of the islands unless the islanders themselves, who considered themselves British, consented, citing their right to self-determination, another key UN principle.
Hey, I need to launch a campaign in 2 weeks. Let's see.
From the mid-1970s, the two nations' relationship began to slide downhill after a military junta seized control of Argentina in 1976. By the end of that year, Buenos Aires had severed ambassadorial relations with Britain and put 50 military personnel ashore on southern Thule, a fantastically isolated area in the South Sandwich Islands, which were also controlled by Britain and claimed by Argentina. Remote as they were, this was a clear attack on Britain's sovereignty over its South Atlantic territories and a shot across the bows on the Falklands issue. It was serious and provoked a response from Britain of nothing other than strongly worded letters. The Argentine presence on southern Thule was not evicted. The British House of Commons would not even find out about the occupation of southern Thule for 2 years after it happened. Efforts to resolve the issue continued after the election of Margaret Thatcher's government in 1979, which had the novel idea of transferring sovereignty to Argentina but leasing the islands back to Britain for 99 years afterwards. This seemed like a clever solution but fell apart in the face of opposition from first the Falkland Islanders and then British MPs. By 1981, the UK had no clear plan on the Falklands other than playing for time and trying to avoid the Argentinians doing anything too dramatic. The trouble was, to Argentina it looked rather a lot like Britain just wasn't that bothered about the islands at all. In 1981, the Thatcher government announced massive defence spending cuts after a review by the Defence Secretary John Nott. Whitehall cuts to the defence budget were nothing new, but this particular round was an absolute hammer blow to the Royal Navy, which was to lose both its carriers and amphibious assault ships. Prime Minister Thatcher approved these cuts because she was keen that Britain's overall public expenditure had to be slashed. Perhaps most importantly, she agreed with Knott's desire to withdraw the Navy's only presence in the South Atlantic, the patrol ship HMS Endurance. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, had opposed this, insisting that the withdrawal of the ship would be taken as a sign of Britain's lack of commitment to the Falklands, but he was overruled. Carrington, it turned out, was broadly right. The government in Buenos Aires saw Britain slashing its military and removing its presence on the South Atlantic, and interpreted it as a sign that Britain's commitment to the islands was waning. This came on top of London's non-response to the occupation of southern Thule and the total disregard of the Shackleton Report in the mid-1970s, which had recommended £12 million of government investment in the islands. As far as the junta could make out, Britain had no interest in investing economically in the islands, no interest in defending it militarily, and no interest in responding to breaches of its sovereignty. If we're asking why Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, it might be because the UK government gave them every reason in the world to think that they would get away with it. It was against this backdrop of British weakness and apparent disinterest that a new Argentine junta took office in December 1981, led by General Leopoldo Galtieri. At the time, Argentina had severe economic problems that the new president needed a distraction from, so he planned 1982 to be the year of the Malvinas. Either Britain would hand the islands over, or Argentina would take them. To minimise any prospect of a British response to this, the junta planned to occupy the islands in September 1982, as by this time HMS Endurance would be on her way back to Britain, and the Argentine Navy would have completed its procurement of 18 French-built Superintendar strike fighters, complete with modern Exocet anti-ship missiles. Until then, diplomacy would continue between the nations. The Argentine Foreign Minister, Nicanor Costa Mendes, sought to prepare the ground for an invasion, issuing a statement in February 1982 warning that Argentina was prepared to use other means to regain the islands if diplomacy failed. It was a carefully planned diplomatic offensive, calibrated to peak just at the moment the invasion was scheduled for in September. But then, out of the blue, the entire plan was turned upside down by the most unlikely of sources. On March 17, 1982, a group of scrap metal workers landed on the British-controlled and Argentinian-claimed island of South Georgia, about 900 miles southwest of the Falklands. They were charged with dismantling an old whaling station at Leith to which their boss, Constantino Davidoff, had bought the rights in 1979. The group travelled in the Argentine Navy transport Bahia Buen Suceso, which had been hired as a private charter with, supposedly, no military personnel on board. The British authorities had given permission for Davidoff's crew to make the journey, but requested a permit be picked up from the British base on the island at Grytviken. 2 days after landing, though, no Argentinian had reported to Grytviken, and worse, an Argentine flag had been spotted flying at Leith. Now, it's possible that this was just an over-exuberant metal worker, but it's also very possible, as some sources suggest, the Argentine government had slipped some Marines aboard the apparently civilian charter to try and repeat the trick of southern Thule 6 years before. Either way, the British certainly feared something sinister was going on. Staff at Grytviken reported to Rex Hunt, the governor of the Falklands, who ordered that they insist the metal workers lower the flag and report to Grytviken. The flag was removed soon afterwards, but still nobody appeared to get the required approvals. As a result, Governor Hunt made a report to London, reporting that what he believed to be Argentine military troops had landed on South Georgia, and gave his opinion that the whole expedition was probably a cover for a seizure of the island. On receipt of Hunt's message, the British government ramped things up. They demanded that the Argentines leave South Georgia and ordered HMS Endurance to sail for the island from the Falklands with 22 Royal Marines on board. On March 21st, the Bahia Buen Suceso quickly left South Georgia, perhaps because it had been caught out putting troops where they shouldn't have been, but did not, crucially, take the metalworkers with it. On March 23rd, the Foreign Secretary sent an ultimatum: remove the metalworkers, or the Royal Marines would do so by force. This message from the British was a sharp and sudden escalation and put the Argentine junta in a bit of a difficult position. Deciding that they could not suffer the indignity of Argentine workers being arrested and deported at gunpoint from what they saw as rightful Argentinian land, the junta dispatched their own vessel to South Georgia with 14 Marines on board. By March 25th, there were two rival armed parties on South Georgia, 20 miles apart. With Britain suddenly and unexpectedly responding forcefully to events in the South Atlantic, Argentina now dramatically accelerated its plans. Worried that the Brits might reinforce the Falklands amid the crisis, the invasion plans were brought up and the Argentine Navy asked to carry out the landings as quickly as possible. Just days later, on March 28th, a large Argentine fleet put to sea under Vice Admiral Juan Lombardo, bound for the Falklands. Task Force 20, including the aircraft carrier 25 de Mayo, was present only as a demonstration of Argentina's power, with Task Force 40 under Rear Admiral Carlos Bucer to carry out operations against the islands. This group contained the Argentine Navy's most modern ships, including the two Type 42 anti-air destroyers that had been bought from Britain in the 1970s. As the Argentinian invasion flotilla sailed into some bad autumn weather on the evening of March 28th, its movement was picked up by British intelligence. Britain was desperate to avoid an Argentine invasion and pushed the United States, who had established themselves as allies of Argentina in the 1970s, to warn off the junta from such a course of action. President Reagan would eventually speak with Galtieri, but with no success. The UK government also started to take military action, hoping it could do some last-minute deterrence. 3 nuclear-powered attack submarines were hurriedly prepared for dispatch to the South Atlantic, but the first would not arrive for 10 days. In the meantime, HMS Endurance, steaming on March 31st as fast as it could back towards the Falklands, would be very much alone. As far as her captain Nick Barker knew, the nearest British naval unit was at Gibraltar, 7,000 miles away. By the evening of April 1st, Task Force 40 was approaching its landing points near Port Stanley. Final preparations were made. Rear Admiral Bucer addressed the landing force aboard the assault ship Cabo San Antonio. "We have been chosen by destiny to carry out one of the dearest ambitions of the Argentine people, to recover the Malvinas Islands. I expect from you bravery in battle, respect for your enemy, and generosity in victory. I warn you that if there are any excesses against the enemy troops, women, or private property, I will impose the maximum penalty."
This is just a drill. Leave your laptops.
It's too heavy. Go on without me.
We would never leave a good bit of veg behind. Oh, thanks, Colin.
Gosh, mad about veg.
What if there was a song about Lost in Translation in the style of jazz? It's lost in translation.
At 9:30 p.m. on April 1st, the Type 42 destroyer Santissima Trinidad dropped anchor about a mile off to the coast of Stanley, the capital of the Falkland Islands. Rubber boats were lowered into the water and just shy of 90 Argentinian commandos began their journey to the coast. It took an hour and a half for the Marines to paddle to the shore, getting stuck amongst kelp beds on the way, and ending up making landfall at Lake Point, some distance east of their intended landing area, up Mullet Creek. This meant they would have more ground to cover to reach their objectives and would need to get a move on. The commandos divided into 2 groups, most of their strength under the command of Lieutenant Commander Sanchez Sabarots, headed 6 miles northwest to Moody Brook Barracks, where the Royal Marine garrison of around 70 soldiers was expected to be. A smaller party of 16 men, led by Lieutenant Commander Pedro Jaquino, began a hike to Government House to arrest the governor and seize control of the island. Sabarot's company surrounded the barracks at 5:30 a.m. to leave the Marines with no escape. They were surprised to discover that the barracks were in fact completely deserted, but this didn't stop them pouring gunfire and tear gas and other grenades into the building regardless. This sudden eruption of fire at Moody Brooks was clearly audible several miles away in Stanley, where the Royal Marines were actually positioned. Under Major Mike Norman, they had manned a variety of locations to the east designed to intercept an Argentine force landing on the expected beaches west of Cape Pembroke. At 6:05 a.m, the sound of gunfire coming from the west of Government House rang alarm bells for Major Norman. Most of his troops were facing the wrong way if the attack came from this direction. He ordered 2 sections to relocate and take up positions west and south of Government House to bolster its defences, and hurried there himself. At 6:15, Lieutenant Commander Giacchino, still sticking to the plan that assumed the Royal Marines would be asleep in their barracks, approached the rear of the building with 4 of his men. They barely made it into the grounds at the rear of the house before gunfire rang out from the defending Marines, mortally wounding Lieutenant Commander Giacchino and pinning the others down. A furious gun battle now began, with machine gun fire and stun grenades thrown from the Argentinian commandos. By 6:20, the attack had stalled and the Argentines retreated, leaving Giacchino and 2 other wounded behind. Luckily for them, reinforcements were on the way. At 6:30, the main landing force began to arrive west of Cape Pembroke, with 20 Amtraks departing from Cabo San Antonio and rolling ashore, carrying troops from the 2nd Marine Battalion. Pushing south, they seized the airport and detached 1 army platoon to clear the runway, and then pushed across a narrow bit of land known as the Neck. 2 British sections under Lieutenant Bill Trollope prepared to engage the column just outside Stanley. At 7:15, they fired on the lead group with 2 anti-tank launchers. Initial shots were wayward, but when one vehicle closed to within 150 metres, it was hit twice with rockets and began to billow with smoke. The Royal Marines did not have time to cheer this success though. Fire from the other Amtraks intensified and soon forced them to retreat into Stanley. They fought a rearguard action back towards Government House, exchanging small arms fire with the oncoming Argentines. By 8 a.m, the situation was deteriorating for the British. The commandos from Moody Brooks had pushed east and were now engaged in increasingly heavy fighting around Government House, while the Royal Marines ultimately did not have the equipment to take on the Amtraks that were rolling their way through Stanley. Reluctantly, at 9:30, Governor Hunt agreed to stop fighting. An Argentine flag was raised over Government House, and the battle was over. Against hopeless odds, the Royal Marines had resisted for 3 hours and suffered no casualties of their own. The numbers killed and wounded for Argentina are contested and range from 1 killed, 2 wounded to perhaps 20 to 30 casualties, but there's a number of conflicting accounts. Within hours of the end of the battle, the defeated British personnel were flown off the islands, though not before some propaganda photos had been taken of them lying face down and distributed widely, and repatriated back to the UK via Uruguay in the coming days. By the afternoon of April 2nd, more Argentine troops were flying in to take up garrison duty, and a team of officials were arriving to set up their civil administration of the islands. Las Malvinas had been recaptured, and there were scenes of jubilation on the streets of Buenos Aires. The mood was quite the opposite in London. News of the invasion slowly filtered through on April 2nd, and it sent shockwaves through the British government. Its attempts at deterrence and delay over years had failed. Margaret Thatcher faced a fiery House of Commons on Saturday, April 3rd. Far from being the acclaimed Iron Lady she would later be known as, Thatcher had to fight for her government's political survival in a chamber angry at both the Argentines and her administration's handling of the crisis. The Prime Minister's attempts to explain the government's actions over the previous days were met with first derisive laughter.
Yesterday morning at 8:33 a.m. we sent a telegram. At 8...
and then later general outrage.
I contacted President Reagan that evening and asked him to intervene with the Argentine president directly. We promised in the meantime to take no action to escalate the dispute for fear of precipitating the very event.
faced with political oblivion if the nation allowed this seizure of the Falklands to stand, Thatcher announced that
The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete. HMS Invincible will be in the lead and will leave port on Monday.
behind this short sentence was the largest and riskiest mobilisation of the British Armed Forces in 3 decades. The islands were 8,000 miles away and occupied by a nation with over 300 modern aircraft that could fly from air bases only a few hundred miles away from the islands. A British task force would be outnumbered, a long way from any help, and would need to be supported by a logistical train which didn't exist at the start of April 1982. It would be the riskiest military deployment since the disaster of the Suez Crisis 3 decades before. This didn't stop the Royal Navy under the leadership of Admiral Henry Leach from being convinced it was possible. With the Defence Secretary John Knott being pessimistic, Leach told the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher that the first wave of a full task force, including 2 aircraft carriers, could be sailed within days, and that the Navy could take the islands back by force if required. Convinced by Admiral Leach's enthusiasm, Thatcher gave the green light, and Her Majesty's Naval Service swung into action.
I just built a budgeting app with Base 44.
Nina just built an app.
So we can all build apps now? I'm on lunch.
In a stroke of good fortune, the Navy had the core of a large-scale deployment already assembled at Gibraltar. The first flotilla had been conducting exercises under Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward. At 2:30 a.m. on April 3rd, just hours after the Argentine invasion of the Falklands, Woodward departed for the South Atlantic, leading a group of 5 frigates and 5 destroyers, which would make up the core of the carrier group charged with taking the islands back. Back in England, frantic work was just beginning to provide Woodward ships with some aircraft carriers to escort. When Argentina invaded, both of Britain's carriers were alongside at Portsmouth. Hermes was even in the middle of a 6-week maintenance period. There was furious activity to get them operational in early April. Within days, anti-submarine Sea Kings were being flown up from Royal Naval Air Station Culdrose, joined by transport helicopters and every available Sea Harrier from RNAS Yeovilton. With its vertical takeoff and landing ability, the Sea Harrier could land directly onto the carriers whilst they were still in port, saving valuable time. As a result, on April 5th, both Hermes and Invincible left Portsmouth in a blaze of publicity intended as a statement to Argentina of Britain's resolve. It had been just 3 days since the Argentine invasion. As well as warships, Britain also had to find ground troops capable of landing on and liberating the Falklands. 3 Royal Marine and 2 parachute battalions were quickly earmarked for service in the South Atlantic, but the Navy didn't have any way of getting them there. To solve this, the British government turned to its age-old power to requisition the nation's merchant ships in time of war. The 45,000-ton cruise liner Canberra, which was by coincidence on her way back to the UK from the Mediterranean, was quickly targeted. UK officials boarded the ship at Gibraltar, assessing the modifications she would need for service in the South Atlantic. A plan for a custom-built helicopter landing pad to go over the swimming pool was designed on the back of an envelope, telephoned back to the UK, and fabricated before the liner even arrived back in England. Canberra docked at Southampton on April 7th, disembarked her passengers, had extensive modifications, and sailed 60 hours later with 2,500 Royal Marines and paratroopers on board. It was a remarkable turnaround. Absolutely nothing had been allowed to stand in the way of her departure. It was a similar story up and down the country as dozens of civilian ships were pressed into service for all kinds of roles as Britain tried to construct an 8,000-mile-long logistics chain from scratch in a few days. By the end of April, there were 65 ships at sea, of which 40 were either Royal Fleet Auxiliary Support ships or civilian ships pressed into service. Sailing south as fast as their diesel engines would carry them, the nascent task force headed first for British-controlled Ascension Island in the mid-Atlantic, arriving there piecemeal throughout April and May 1982. This tiny and quiet island in the Atlantic became subject to a frenzy as the ships of the task force arrived and the RAF lifted in everything the task force needed but could not for whatever reason take with it from the UK. At its peak, the island's airport handled over 400 flights a day, making Ascension briefly the busiest airport in the world. This huge operation was supported in no small part by the United States, though in secret, as the Americans were trying to broker a diplomatic solution to the crisis. The airbase on the island was run by the US to support a NASA satellite tracking station, and its commander, Lieutenant Colonel W. Bryden, reportedly said that he had been ordered to help, but not to get caught doing it. The US kept the fuel tank at Ascension topped up, and funneled shipments of the latest type of Sidewinder air-to-air missile into British hands. After a brief stop, Rear Admiral Woodward's carrier battle group departed Ascension Island on April 18th. It would take another 2 weeks for the carriers to reach the Falklands, but Britain was not going to wait that long to start military operations. Sailing ahead of the main force was a task group bound for South Georgia, a British territory about 900 miles southeast of the Falklands, that the Argentinians had seized on April 3rd. HMS Antrim, Plymouth and the tanker Tidespring had now been dispatched to take it back, carrying a company of Royal Marines as well as D Squadron from the SAS. This force would link up with the ice patrol ship HMS Endurance, who had remained at sea monitoring the Argentine occupiers since the start of the month. The task group, under the command of Captain Brian Young, arrived off South Georgia on April 21st. Wasting no time, the British ships immediately began operations against Argentine positions, but ran into trouble when 2 Wessex 5 helicopters crashed whilst recovering an SAS reconnaissance patrol west of Leith. Those involved were eventually rescued without loss by this aircraft, HMS Antrim's Wessex 3, but it was a sharp reminder of the fraught danger that came with operating in this part of the world. The situation did not get much better for the British when intelligence arrived the following day that an Argentinian submarine was in the vicinity of South Georgia. This was a massive threat. If a submarine could pick off one of the British ships, that could spell the end of the South Georgia operation and possibly the entire Falklands campaign, if the political and public will to continue collapsed in the face of a military setback. Captain Young withdrew his force out to sea for safety, where they were reinforced on April 24th by the frigate HMS Brilliant, who had been detached from the vanguard of the task force some days earlier and came with 2 Lynx anti-submarine helicopters. With this added strength, the British force returned to South Georgia with the exception of RFA Tidespring, which was carrying the Marine Company and was kept out of harm's way for the time being. On the morning of April 25th, the British warships mobilised their helicopters to hunt down the Argentine submarine. In the lead again was Antrim's Wessex 3, nicknamed Humphrey and piloted by Lieutenant Commander Ian Stanley. Stanley and his crew searched initially with only the naked eye to avoid detection by their opponent, before resorting to a single sweep on the helicopter's radar to see if they could locate the boat. Almost immediately, the ARA Santa Fe appeared on Humphrey's radar screen. The submarine was steaming northwest on the surface, having dropped a platoon of Marines at Grytviken to reinforce the Argentine garrison there. Lieutenant Commander Stanley called in its location before dropping 2 depth charges, one of which physically bounced off Santa Fe's conning tower before exploding. At this, the submarine turned back towards Grytviken, a small oil slick becoming visible on the surface, an indication of damage within. A link from HMS Brilliant was next on the scene, firing off a homing torpedo before WASPs from Endurance and Plymouth opened fire with their AS-12 rocket missiles. The first of these, from Lieutenant Commander John Ellerbeck's aircraft, was the first missile ever fired by the Royal Navy in anger. The missiles were not big enough to do serious damage to the submarine, but they punched enough holes in the conning tower to prevent Santa Fe from submerging. Harried by almost half a dozen helicopters, Santa Fe limped her way into Grytviken harbour, where her crew abandoned the sub and made their way to the garrison's position at King Edward Point. It was at this stage that the British decided to press their advantage. The element of surprise was now gone, and it wouldn't do to allow the Argentine reinforcements to settle in. It was time, as Major Cedric Delves, in command of the SAS at South Georgia, puts it, to go with instinct, fast and furious. The Royal Marine Company, who had been intended to lead the assault on Grytviken, were that afternoon still 200 miles away aboard RFA Tidespring, so any quick assault would have to go in without them, using the SAS troops and a handful of Royal Marines that were on board the other ships. They'd be facing about 100 defenders in prepared positions, but had the crucial advantage of naval gunfire and helicopters. The operation began at 2:30 p.m, with the SAS and Marines being carried ashore by Humphrey and Brilliant's Lynxes. They landed south of Grytviken and pushed up the Brown Mountain Ridge, while 4.5-inch naval shells bombarded King Edward Point, though aimed at this stage to land near the defenders to demoralise them rather than cause casualties. The land troops under the command of Royal Marine Major Guy Sheridan then advanced to within 1,000 yards of the garrison, before HMS Antrim steamed right into the bay and threatened to fire directly at the Argentines unless they surrendered. A voice soon came back on the radio. "No shoot, no shoot." The Argentinian commander, Lieutenant Commander Luis Lagos, appreciated the overwhelming strength of his opponents and, like the British Royal Marines 3 weeks earlier, wisely decided to surrender. With this and the surrender of Lieutenant Alfredo Astiz at Leith the following day, South Georgia was restored to British control. Captain Young sent a signal that was passed on to London, proclaiming,
"Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack in South Georgia. God save the Queen."
What had begun as a fraught and almost disastrous operation ended in complete success for the British, with an early victory banked and the credibility of the Navy to carry out operations in the South Atlantic cemented. There was just one fatality on South Georgia, Chief Petty Officer Felix Artuso, who was tragically shot dead after the surrender when a Royal Marine Guard thought he was trying to scuttle the Santa Fe. And so, with the first military victory in the bag, the Royal Navy's ships departed, with Captain Young's ships rejoining the main British task force on April 29th. The carriers were now approaching the Falklands, and the prospect of any diplomatic solution was receding fast. The Falklands War was about to begin in earnest, and begin with one of the most controversial military actions since the Second World War.
At the start, you get to pick a shelter freely. Once chosen, there is no going back. It will be your only home on this alien world, so be sure to pick the one that feels most comforting to you. In the days ahead, you will want...
By the start of May 1982, the Falklands crisis had lasted a month since the Argentine invasion and was without resolution. A British task force had spent the second half of April pushing relentlessly south, resolved to use force to recover the islands if diplomacy failed. The only diversion had been to recapture South Georgia, and the ships involved in that operation returned to the main task force under the local command of Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward on April 29th. As the Royal Navy made its way south, the British government had established a 200-mile maritime exclusion zone around the Falklands, designed to limit Argentine reinforcement by prohibiting any ship from entering on pain of being sunk. As the task force got closer to the islands and the risk of military confrontation went up, at the end of April the UK government increased the strength of its measures. The exclusion zone was expanded to become a total exclusion zone, with aircraft now also prohibited from going near the Falklands. The British task force crossed into the exclusion zone on the night of May 1st. With diplomatic negotiations at an end and now with the full backing of the United States, Britain loudly announced its task force's arrival, launching bombing raids against Stanley and Goose Green airfields and bombarding Argentine land positions around the capital. Argentina responded in kind, launching more than 40 aircraft to engage the British that afternoon and bringing its powerful naval forces into play. From the northwest, in two groups, came the bulk of Argentina's naval strength, including the aircraft carrier 25 de Mayo with its Skyhawk attack aircraft. The British had positioned 2 of their nuclear submarines in this area to try and find the carrier, but had not been able to locate it. To the south of the islands, a third group was pushing eastwards, comprising the old cruiser General Belgrano and the destroyers Hipólito Bouchard and Piedra Buena. The 2 destroyers were of greatest concern. they were armed with Exocet anti-ship missiles, which could strike targets with a devastating warhead from 22 nautical miles away. From the morning of May 1st, the submarine HMS Conqueror was in contact with the Belgrano group and reported its progress to the British task force. As the day wore on, the British became increasingly concerned about the whereabouts of Argentina's aircraft carrier. With Conqueror reporting the Belgrano group heading east, the Royal Navy worried that the carrier was doing the same, setting up a pincer movement against the British forces. These fears went into overdrive when overnight on May 2nd, an Argentine tracker reconnaissance aircraft was picked up on British radar. A Sea Harrier flown by Flight Lieutenant Ian Mortimer was quickly readied and dispatched to investigate. It didn't find the aircraft, but less than an hour after takeoff, it picked up several large radar contacts just 200 miles from HMS Hermes. The Harrier also picked up the same kind of radar emissions as those used by Britain's Type 42 destroyers. These had to have come from one of Argentina's own Type 42s, and this almost certainly meant the presence of the carrier. This was now the crucial moment for Britain's decision to sink the Belgrano. The British task force was at midnight about 120 miles northeast of the Falklands, sailing on a southeast course around the islands. 200 miles to its northwest, Rear Admiral Woodward now knew there was an Argentinian carrier group which would be in position to launch a raid against his ships at dawn in 7 hours' time. No submarine was in contact with the carrier, and so a strike against it was impossible. Meanwhile, to the south of the Falklands, just outside the exclusion zone, HMS Conqueror continued to be in touch with the General Belgrano and its attendant Exocet armed destroyers. A position report from Conqueror placed it about 230 miles from the task force's area of operations, heading eastwards. On this course, the Belgrano group was not an immediate threat, but as Woodward puts it, the speed and direction of an enemy ship can be irrelevant because both can change quickly. What counts is his position, his capability, and what I believe to be his intentions. The Argentine destroyers could travel at 35 knots, so from their last reported position they could potentially dart into the exclusion zone and be within Exocet range of HMS Hermes by the time the sun came up. Conqueror would struggle to track all three ships at once, even if it could pass through the shallow water of the Birdwood Bank without being detected. Rear Admiral Woodward might then be faced with the nightmare scenario of having to position his ship to defend against an air attack from the northwest, only for 16 Exocet missiles to appear from the south. Faced with this dreadful prospect, Woodward decided he needed the Belgrano to be sunk and the southern group dispersed, so that he could at least fully prepare for the expected air assault. The trouble was, even though Britain had publicly made clear that any warship posing a threat could be sunk, its internal rules of engagement did not allow Conqueror to engage a ship outside the exclusion zone, and these could only be changed by the government in London. An urgent request for an alteration was quickly sent, and luckily back in London both Vice Admiral John Fieldhouse and Rear Admiral Peter Herbert had reached the same conclusion as Woodward and were putting the wheels in motion. The issue was taken to that morning's meeting of the British War Cabinet, and action was taken. Contrary to depictions in lots of popular media, there was no moment where Margaret Thatcher declared, "Sink it," but instead a directive was issued that began, "All vessels positively identified as either an Argentine aircraft carrier, cruiser, destroyer, frigate, corvette, or submarine may be attacked." Now, by the time this order was issued, Belgrano had actually reversed course and was heading westwards. This was because the planned Argentinian pincer attack had been cancelled before dawn due to wind levels being insufficient for the Skyhawk aircraft to get airborne with the required munitions and fuel. The Argentine Navy had previously been offered an aircraft that would be able to operate in these low wind conditions, but had turned it down. That aircraft was, of course, the Sea Harrier. With their offensive foiled by the weather, the carrier group under Rear Admiral Gualter Ajara was ordered to head back near to the mainland to await further developments. The British expected the Argentine ship to simply be repositioning for another attempted attack that night, and the Royal Navy was not about to rely on the weather to prevent it again. And so, as the sun began to set, Commander Chris Reeford Brown of HMS Conqueror began his attack run on the ARA General Belgrano. The submarine ghosted in close to its target, and at 2:57 p.m. fired 3 Mark 8 torpedoes. These were old World War II vintage torpedoes with massive warheads, which would be needed to punch through the Belgrano's thick World War II era armour plating. In quick succession, 2 torpedoes found their mark, blowing the bow clean off and causing a sheet of flame to burst through the deck at the stern. The cruiser ground to a halt and began to sink fast. At 3:17, Captain Hector Bonzo ordered abandon ship, and minutes later, General Belgrano was gone. 323 sailors went down with her. The rest of the Argentine Navy, now firmly aware of the exceptional danger that Britain's nuclear submarines posed, went straight back to port and stayed there, with Argentinian naval power playing no further meaningful role in the war. The sinking of the Belgrano made global headlines as soon as news of it was released. On May 3rd, the Argentine government announced the loss of the cruiser and called its sinking a treacherous act of armed aggression, as it had occurred outside the exclusion zone. To an international audience, the attack on the Belgrano came as a brutal shock, with hundreds of conscript sailors killed without warning by a British submarine. International support for Britain wavered, not helped by its own statement on the sinking being riddled with untruths. The Defence Secretary John Knott referred on May 3rd to the Belgrano closing on elements of our task force, which was only hours away when it was sunk. This was completely untrue. The Belgrano had been heading away from Britain's ships when she was sunk.
The data, there's too much of it.
That's okay. SAS Via builds models and makes decisions, so you don't have to freak out.
But we like freaking out.
We're getting so much done!
From data to ta-da, SAS Via.
The British government for years after the sinking was evasive and secretive about the attack on Belgrano, both to the public and to parliamentary inquiries. It's frankly bizarre that they acted like this, though. On the face of the information available to the British at the time of the sinking, it's difficult to see what other option they had. To allow hostile naval forces to continually move into threatening positions at will would be to take a colossal risk with their own ships and sailors. Ultimately, Argentina had begun hostilities the previous month, and towards the end of April had been warned in a statement that a ship which could amount to a threat to interfere with the mission of the British forces in the South Atlantic will encounter the appropriate response. The implication of this was that irrespective of a ship's location in relation to the exclusion zone, if it was deemed a threat, it could be sunk. Argentina's navy recognised this. The commander of Argentina's carrier group said later that after that message of 23 April, the entire South Atlantic was an operational theatre for both sides. Hector Bonzo, the captain of the Belgrano, also spoke up, arguing that the sinking of the cruiser was an act of war. It was not a crime. It was a legal, most unfortunate and lamentable action. To him and other senior Argentine officers, hostilities had commenced the previous day and they could expect to take and receive blows. Indeed, Captain Bonzo went on to say that if the submarine should have been before me having emerged for repairs, I would have opened fire with the 15 guns until it sunk. The sinking of the Belgrano was the largest single loss of life of the entire Falklands War, and its most controversial moment. But it was just the beginning. While Argentina returned its surface vessels to port after the loss of the Belgrano, its land-based aircraft remained every bit as dangerous as before, and 2 days later they would inflict a shattering loss. Argentina in 1982 had a large fleet of powerful Western-built aircraft, including American-made Skyhawks and Israeli-produced Daggers. The latest addition to this armada of more than 300 planes was the French Superintendar strike fighter, which was designed to operate Exocet anti-ship missiles. Capable of delivering a 165-kilogram warhead at over 700 miles an hour, The Exocet was a modern, highly dangerous missile, and the British knew it would be the single biggest threat to their ships during the Falklands War. As a key part of their naval strike force, Argentina had ordered 14 Superintendars and 15 Exocet missiles, but only 5 of each had been received before France suspended deliveries in the wake of the invasion of the Falklands. With such a limited stock, it was decided that the Intendars would only deploy from their base at Rio Grande in pairs, when opportune moments to strike the British carriers arose. On the morning of May 4th, one such opportunity was presented when a Neptune reconnaissance aircraft detected the British task force southeast of the Falklands. Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward had his flagship HMS Hermes about 75 miles south of Stanley. He was keeping his ships relatively close to the coast in order to support shore bombardment and reconnaissance operations being mounted against Argentine land positions. May 4th was expected to be a relatively quiet day, with a single air raid against Goose Green the only planned operation. 450 miles away, a pair of Superintendars had other ideas as they took off from Rio Grande at 8:45 am. Piloted by Lieutenant Commander Augusto Bedacaratz and Sub-Lieutenant Armando Mayora, the Superintendars flew east without escort, relying on surprise and the long range of their missiles to mount a successful raid. They would ordinarily not have the range to reach the reported British ships, but they were able to refuel in mid-air from a Hercules tanker to massively extend their range. 120 miles out from the reported contacts, the two aircraft descended to flight just 50 feet above the sea, so that the curvature of the Earth would hide them from British radar screens. Flying on in poor visibility, at 9:56 am Bedacaratz and Mayora popped up and briefly switched on their radars, looking for the British ships. They found nothing, so dropped down to sea level once more, pressing on at more than 500 knots towards where their target should be. Less than 50 miles away, the British fleet was sailing southwestwards. The ships of the task force were strung out in an anti-air formation and had dealt with repeated false alarms over incoming hostile aircraft that morning. Furthest east were the most important ships, the carriers Hermes and Invincible, each accompanied by a goalkeeper ship armed with the short-range Seawolf missile, positioned as the last line of defence. In front of these were layers of protection, the most important of which were the 3 Type 42 anti-air destroyers, positioned 20 miles ahead of the main task force. Coventry, Glasgow and Sheffield were tasked with intercepting any hostile air attacks before they could reach the carriers and do critical damage. There were also Sea Harriers in the air running combat air patrol to the northeast, but due to the low cloud base on May 4th, their ability to quickly respond to threats was limited. At 9:56 and 30 seconds, HMS Glasgow picked up the radar emissions from the Intendar's first attempt to establish contact with the task force. Its operations room snapped into gear, correctly identifying the source of the Superintendar and broadcasting a warning to the rest of the task force. But HMS Sheffield, who was closer to the approaching aircraft than Glasgow, was silent. At that moment, the southernmost Type 42 was using her satellite communication system, which blocked out certain radar frequencies and meant that Sheffield could not see the same contacts that Glasgow could. Captain Paul Hoddinott of Glasgow had previously banned the use of this system on his ship during daylight hours, but Captain Sam Salt on Sheffield had not done the same. At 9:58, Bedacaratz and Mayora again popped up for a radar sweep, now just 20 miles away from the task force. This time they could make out 2 radar contacts, one smaller than the other. Believing the larger ship to be an aircraft carrier, they pressed their attack and prepared to launch their missiles. By now, Glasgow had direct radar contact with the approaching strike aircraft. The ship's anti-air warfare officer, Lieutenant Commander Nick Hawkyard, quickly reported the incoming raid, but he was frustrated with the response of HMS Invincible, which was not convinced that this latest alarm wasn't another false warning, as others had been that morning. The Sea Harriers on their patrol route were not diverted to intercept the incoming contacts. At 10 am, now somewhat frantic, Glasgow radioed a warning of the incoming attack to Sheffield, but again there was no response. At this critical juncture, both the ship's anti-air warfare officer and one of the radio operators had stepped out of the operations room, leaving it rudderless. Sheffield had also still not made radar contact with the Argentinian jets. This was now partly because Glasgow had given the bearing of the contact as being 235 degrees, but from Sheffield the aircraft would have shown up on a bearing of around 300. This confusion led to Sheffield's radar operators looking in the wrong place and seeing nothing. The superintendents were now just 12 miles out. They turned sharply to starboard, lining themselves up firmly on HMS Sheffield. 10 seconds later, Sheffield's anti-air officer was urgently called back to the ops room over the ship's intercom. This was the first indication to almost all of Sheffield's crew that something was wrong. Before he could get there though, at 10:02 exactly, Bedecaratz and Mayura launched their Exocet missiles and turned away hard, to begin their sprint back to Argentina. With an Exocet travelling at more than 700 miles an hour on its way, Britain's ships now just had seconds to react. Glasgow quickly fired chaff, clouds of small metal filaments designed to confuse the Exocet's radar into missing the ship. On board Sheffield, the anti-air officer returned to the ops room, but misidentified the raid as a pair of Mirage 3s, as he believed the fleet was beyond the range of the Exocet carrying superintendents. Seconds later, the ship's bridge crew caught sight of the missile trails heading their way, but no message was relayed to the ops room, the captain, or to the crew. No chaff was fired. Aboard Glasgow, Captain Hodder ordered his ship's Sea Dart missile system to engage the onrushing Exocets, but the system was designed to engage high-altitude missiles and struggled to lock on to the low-flying and fast-moving projectiles. Sheffield's Sea Dart, meanwhile, could not even see the Exocets on radar. Most of her crew was not even aware there was anything to be worried about. And then, at 10:03 exactly, time ran out for HMS Sheffield. The first Exocet, probably fired by Bedecaratz, smashed into the ship's starboard side amidships, causing a huge fire in the auxiliary machine room. The ship immediately lost half its power and its communications. Thick black smoke forced the evacuation of the bridge and the ops room, and a ruptured fire main crippled firefighting efforts. To make matters worse, the computer systems for the ship's missiles failed, leaving Sheffield defenceless in the face of any subsequent attacks. In the computer room, a team of 5 under Lieutenant Commander John Woodhead remained at their post, trying desperately to restore the ship's defences even as choking smoke filled the air and the blazing fire crept closer. They were eventually successful, but all 5 men perished in the process.
To be honest, sometimes I actually have no idea what's going on until I open Monday.com. And boom, everything's there. Statuses, timelines, but...
Not long after the Exocet hit, the frigates Yarmouth and Arrow arrived to offer assistance, providing hoses and pumps to try and beat back the fire, rapidly engulfing the centre of HMS Sheffield. Helicopters began to evacuate casualties to HMS Hermes, where their arrival was captured by the shocked news cameras of the broadcast media. On Sheffield, firefighters battled for 4 hours against the fire in an attempt to save the ship, but it was a battle they steadily lost. By 1:50 PM, Captain Salt judged that the combat value of the ship was now essentially nil, and keeping the crew on board was not worth the risk that the fire might reach and detonate the Sea Dart magazine. He ordered abandon ship. The crew went across to Yarmouth and Arrow, while Captain Salt and some of his officers were flown by Lynx to Hermes to report to Rear Admiral Woodward. Woodward, grappling with the implications of that morning's events, told Captain Salt, "I suspect someone's been bloody careless." 20 men had died, and Britain had lost 1/3 of its specialist anti-air ships, leaving the task force dangerously exposed until reinforcements in the shape of ships like HMS Exeter and HMS Cardiff could arrive. As the task force digested a serious blow, several hundred miles away, Bedecaratz and Mayura were returning to base, having fired 40% of Argentina's Exocet stocks. When news reports of Sheffield sinking emerged, it was seen by some as revenge for the sinking of the Belgrano 2 days before, but that wasn't how Sub-Lieutenant Mayura saw it. "We didn't feel that it was a retaliation for the Belgrano. The operation was never for that, but we felt that we had proved that we had the ability to sink one of theirs too." The burning hulk of HMS Sheffield remained afloat for several days after she was hit. Once the fire had burnt itself out, the ship was taken under tow by Yarmouth. She reached the edge of the exclusion zone but began to take water on through the hole the Exocet had created. Eventually, Sheffield foundered and capsized, sinking into the Atlantic, where she rests today. The loss of Sheffield was a brutal shock to Britain. It was the Royal Navy's first warship lost by enemy action since the end of the Second World War, and a very sudden reminder to the British government and public of the realities of fighting a war. Militarily, it forced the Royal Navy to be more cautious with its task force, keeping further east and away from the Intendar base at Rio Grande. But it also hardened their resolve to see the campaign through to a victorious conclusion. After days of fighting at sea and in the air, attention would now turn to the plans for a full-scale amphibious landing on the Falklands, and some of the most tense days of the entire war. But before any landings could take place, the British had to find out what they would be facing at the intended landing areas. On the night of May 10th, the frigate HMS Alacrity was ordered to pass through Falkland Sound in a bid to see if the Argentines had mined the channel between the two main islands. As Alacrity did not sink in this process, it was figured that there were no mines present. The decision was therefore taken to land Britain's troops at San Carlos Bay on East Falkland, far enough away from the main Argentine positions to be confident of a smooth landing, but not so far away as to make it impractical to mount an offensive towards Stanley. There was one major problem though, an Argentine base on Pebble Island, just off the north coast of the main islands. It housed a small airbase which the British thought likely to hold Picara ground attack aircraft. Armed with bombs or rocket pods as well as 20mm cannons, these propeller-driven aircraft could do serious damage to British troops as they tried to come ashore, and would be based only 4 minutes flying time away from the prospective landing beaches. This made Pebble Island a substantial risk, and it was not one that Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, the local commander of the British carrier group, was prepared to tolerate. He wanted the base neutralised, but there were not a lot of good options to achieve this. Bombardment by air or sea was ruled out as too imprecise. It could not guarantee the destruction of any aircraft, and it carried the unacceptable risk of explosives hitting the civilian settlement on the island. Luckily for Woodward, the contingent of special forces aboard his flagship had a plan which could solve both these problems. Under the command of Major Cedric Delves, D Squadron of the Special Air Service had been aboard HMS Hermes since the start of May, after their involvement in the recapture of South Georgia was concluded. Delves and his men had been searching for a way to make themselves useful to the task force and had already settled on Pebble Island as a potentially lucrative target. They proposed landing SAS troops onto the island by helicopter to disable the airfield and any aircraft by hand, with demolition charges and anti-tank weapons. It was a daring plan, evoking similar operations that the nascent SAS had carried out in North Africa during the Second World War. Woodward was keen on the idea, but the potential risks were huge and information about the target was very scarce. A reconnaissance team under Captain Timothy Burles was immediately dispatched to the area on the evening of May 11th, but were delayed by bad weather from being able to observe the Argentine positions until dawn on May 13th. By then, time was running very short. Rear Admiral Woodward had set a deadline of dawn on May 15th to complete the operation. Any later and it would overlap with possible dates for the main landings at San Carlos. So as soon as Captain Burles was able to report the presence of 11 Argentine aircraft, the operation was swiftly greenlit for the early hours of May 15th. The SAS troops would be flown to and from their target by Sea Kings from HMS Hermes, which meant detaching the British flagship, arguably the most important warship in the South Atlantic, to sail almost alone several hundred miles away from the main body of the task force. Only the destroyer Glamorgan and frigate Broadsword would accompany it on a voyage which would leave the carrier highly vulnerable. Major Delves meanwhile had to prepare his men for a deployment about which they knew almost nothing. The lack of time to prepare meant that the 3 remaining troops would deploy on the island with almost no information about what they'd be facing, and would have to rely on those already deployed acting as guides. The plan did at least benefit from being brutally simple. It was essentially a frontal attack with the entire squadron, with surprise and chaos as their chief allies. 18 Troop would join the already deployed 17 Troop in spearheading the attack, with 16 and 19 troops playing supporting roles. Aircraft, ground facilities and aircrew were all to be targeted if possible. And so at 6 PM on May 14th, Hermes detached from the fleet and sped west as quickly as she could. It wasn't long before a fearsome gale blew up and the three ships lost speed battling against huge waves. The timetable for the operation began to slip. What was supposed to be a 6-hour journey ended up being more like 7, and the Sea Kings containing the raiding party did not take off until 2:25 AM, badly behind schedule. As the special forces made their way towards the target, to the south, HMS Glamorgan was taking up position to provide naval gunfire support to the troops on the ground as required. It was expecting to do so from around 4 AM, but it was only at 3:50 that D Squadron was arriving on Pebble Island. To keep their arrival hidden from the Argentines, they landed some 5 kilometers away from the target and then had to hike into position, which took until 6:10 AM. It was not long until dawn now. For the safety of the carrier, the British troops would need to be extracted no later than 7:30 AM, leaving Major Delves critically short of time. D Squadron's mortar was hurriedly set up, and the assault troops were sent forward. 18 Troop had fallen behind during the hike, so they were replaced with 19 Troop under Captain Gavin Hamilton. The airfield on Pebble Island was defended by a detachment under Lieutenant Moraga from 3rd Marine Battalion. As the SAS force approached, most of these were asleep in their beds. Only a roving patrol of 4 men, including Moraga, was on duty, as well as 2 more in the guard hut on the airbase. They would have been somewhat surprised when at around 7 AM, all hell suddenly broke loose. The troops under Captains Hamilton and Bowles charged onto the airfield, opening fire with small arms, grenades and anti-tank launchers on anything that looked even remotely hostile. HMS Glamorgan also opened fire, dropping a curtain of high explosive rounds north of the airfield to add to the sense of chaos and encourage Argentine defenders to keep their heads down. Despite this, though, several of the guards did return fire on their assailants, but it was almost impossible to aim through the smoke and half-light of illumination shells fired by the SAS mortar. Lieutenant Moraga and his men were powerless to stop the SAS from reaching the main concentration of aircraft on the western side of the airfield. Within minutes, the SAS set to work destroying these aircraft too, before sweeping around to tackle the aircraft to the south of the Argentine guard hut. As the raid progressed, Lieutenant Moraga began to worry that the attack was a precursor to a larger landing to seize the airfield entirely. Determined to prevent the British from making use of Pebble Island, he moved to activate a series of explosive charges in the runway to make it unusable. This was just as Corporal Armstrong was placing the explosive charge on the 6th and final Pucara. The massive explosion from the Argentine charges blew him off his feet, landing him with a concussion. On the other side of the runway, the charges also destroyed a Skyvan transport aircraft, meaning every single aircraft on Pebble Island was now ablaze. With their mission largely complete and the sky beginning to lighten, it was time for the British to leave. Major Delves gathered his squadron up and pulled back to the rendezvous with the Sea Kings. At exactly 7:30 on the dot, the 4 helicopters appeared from the east and set themselves down. The SAS men scrambled aboard and were taken off, back to HMS Hermes in time for breakfast. It was a raid that had lasted for barely half an hour, planned and executed at incredible speed in the face of a brutal South Atlantic winter. All 11 Argentine aircraft present had been destroyed, with only 3 men wounded on the British side and 2 on the Argentine side. The airfield on Pebble Island that was so close to the upcoming landing beaches had been neutralised, and the stage was now set for Britain's very own D-Day in the South Atlantic. But despite all the planning, preparation and special operations, the landings at San Carlos remained a fundamentally risky proposition, as all amphibious landings are. Under the leadership of Commodore Mike Clapp, a large number of warships, dedicated landing ships and requisitioned merchant ships would have to sail right up to the shoreline and remain there, exposed to whatever Argentina could throw at them for days on end, until the 5 Royal Marine and Parachute battalions have been unloaded and a secure beachhead established. Facing the British was an Argentine army under the military governor of the Falklands, Brigadier General Mario Menendez. Knowing that any British reconquest of the islands could only be successful if they captured the town of Stanley, Menendez was content to concentrate the bulk of his forces around the capital. Smaller garrisons were maintained in outlying areas, including at Goose Green and at San Carlos settlement itself. At sea, the amphibious group of ships carrying the troops joined up with Rear Admiral Woodward's carrier task force on May 18th, and managed to achieve an undetected approach to San Carlos 2 days later, thanks to a helpful blanket of fog. Commodore Clapp's ships made their final approach after dark, with Special Forces operations beginning to take out an Argentine observation post on Fanning Head and suppress the garrison at Goose Green to prevent their interference with the landings. With operations to secure their flanks underway, the British troops began to come ashore from landing craft at 4 AM, beginning with 2 para at the southern end of San Carlos water. The landings were largely uncontested, with the only Argentine unit in the area being a detachment under First Lieutenant Carlos Esteban at Port San Carlos, which pulled back out of the settlement once the scale of the British landing became clear after dawn. From a position to the east, Esteban's unit fought a fierce rearguard action, downing 2 Gazelle Scout helicopters that strayed too close to their position before being compelled to withdraw by the leading elements of 3 para, which liberated Port San Carlos and raised a British flag. The reconquest of the Falklands was underway, but the battle for San Carlos was far from over.
Sounds like Ojo time! Feel the fun with instant payouts and no minimum withdrawals.
I don't listen to Ojo.
Ta-da.
Over. Almost as soon as British troops had stepped foot on land on the morning of May 21st, Argentina's fast jets launched a determined attack on the beachhead. They were operating at maximum range from their base, with no fighter escort. Over the next few days, they would press home attacks on British ships to point-blank range, with only seconds to pick a target once it was in view, and in the face of a maelstrom of fire from British ship-based missile systems, 4.5-inch naval guns, Sea Harriers, and land-based Rapier anti-air missiles. The Argentine attacks on May 21st focused on British warships outside the main San Carlos anchorage, where they acted as picket ships to draw attacks away from the ships unloading troops. This stretch of water in Falkland Sound would soon become known as Bomb Alley. The frigate Argonaut was the first to be hit by 2 bombs from Skyhawks, before HMS Antrim was struck by a bomb from the Dagger. In the start of a trend that was to continue throughout the Battle for San Carlos, none of the bombs exploded, having been fused incorrectly for the altitude they were dropped from. It was a lucky escape for the British. They were not to get so lucky in the afternoon, when 2 pairs of Skyhawks thundered their way towards HMS Ardent. 1 aircraft was downed by a Sea Harrier, but the others got through. 2 500-pound bombs struck the frigate, with 1 exploding and wrecking the hangar area and the ship's Seacat missile launcher, which had failed to engage the low-flying attackers. Ardent lost power to her gun, so was virtually defenceless when at 2 PM 5 more Skyhawks appeared and made straight for the stricken frigate. The ship's crew had little to defend themselves with and could not stop at least 2 more bombs exploding on board, cracking the hull and starting huge fires that soon threatened the torpedo and missile magazines. Commander Alan West, the ship's captain, was left with little alternative but to abandon ship. With the surviving crew taken off, Ardent sank overnight, the first major surface casualty of the Battle of San Carlos. It was the end of a bruising day for both sides. Britain had lost Ardent, while both Argonaut and Antrim were out of action until unexploded ordnance they were carrying could be defused. 33 sailors had been killed, mostly on board Ardent, and 20 injured. On the Argentine side, 10 fast jets had been shot down, fully a quarter of all launched on that day. At the end of May 21st, most British troops were now ashore, but large amounts of their supplies and heavy equipment was still on board the ships. And so after a break for bad weather on May 22nd, the attacks resumed the following day. At 12:40, 4 Skyhawks led by Captain Pablo Caballo approached HMS Broadsword, Yarmouth and Antelope south of Fanning Island. One aircraft was driven off by a Seacat missile and another was shot down by 20mm cannon fire, but the remaining 2 got through and British-made 1,000-pound bombs struck the newly arrived frigate Antelope. Once again they failed to explode, but while attempts to defuse the ordnance were ongoing that evening, one of the bombs detonated. The explosion claimed the life of Staff Sergeant James Prescott and started a huge fire, which caused the ship to be abandoned and eventually reached the Seacat magazine. The dawn light of May 24th revealed an utterly broken ship, which soon sank. Hours later, the Argentine Air Force came in again, this time with more focus on attacking British transports. The landing ships Sir Lancelot and Sir Galahad were hit, but with bombs that, predictably by this stage, did not explode. May 25th was Argentina's National Day, which meant that despite heavy losses of aircraft, the Argentine Air Force would summon all of its remaining strength for an all-out attack on the British ships at San Carlos. It would turn out to probably be their best day of the entire air war. The British, knowing the importance of the day to their opponents, were expecting a big assault. To counteract this, Rear Admiral Woodward moved his carrier group closer to San Carlos, to reduce the flight time for Sea Harrier patrols to and from the combat area. He also maintained a pair of air defence ships northwest of Falkland Sound, where a better radar picture could be produced away from the coast and incoming aircraft could be intercepted. This tactic started effectively. Through the morning, HMS Coventry shot down 2 Skyhawks with its Sea Dart missiles. But that afternoon, 2 pairs approached from different directions simultaneously, and it all went wrong. First, Coventry's Sea Dart failed to fire, and then Broadsword Seawolf did likewise. Nearby Sea Harriers, who had been told to keep their distance to allow the ship's missiles to work as they had done that morning, could not intervene. The British ships were virtually helpless as First Lieutenant Mariano Velasco dropped 3 bombs into Coventry, which all exploded, causing the Type 42 destroyer to sink rapidly. The bad news for the British did not stop there. Also that afternoon, 2 Exocet armed Super Attendars attacked the British carrier group, hitting the SS Atlantic conveyor and starting a huge fire, which quickly destroyed the ship and all but one of its 11 vital Chinook and Wessex helicopters. The attack on conveyor was the last major action of the battle for San Carlos. Only small-scale raids around the bay took place after this point, as the exhausted Argentine Air Force needed time to regroup. Of 62 aircraft available for combat over San Carlos on May 21st, 21 had been lost in the battle. For this, they had sunk 3 British warships and Atlantic conveyor, as well as hitting 6 other ships with bombs that did not explode. Had these detonated correctly, the damage to the landings could have been much more severe. As it was, the British had managed to establish themselves ashore and now prepared for their offensive eastwards. But their immediate troubles were far from over, as the loss of the Atlantic conveyor had also meant the loss of its cargo helicopters, meaning most of the British troops would have to walk east towards the island's capital, Stanley.
He gave them some weird drink. They got diarrhea. Not enough.
Despite this setback, the British wasted no time in going on to the offensive elsewhere. On May 28th, 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, assaulted an outlying Argentine position at Goose Green. In a tough day of fighting which cost the life of the battalion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones, the Paras were able to capture the local airfield and encircle Argentine forces under Lieutenant Colonel Italo Piaggi, forcing a surrender the following morning. Yielding more than 1,000 prisoners, the victory at Goose Green was the first major land victory for the British. The reconquest of the islands was well and truly underway. The recapture of Goose Green was a big first step for the British, but assaulting the positions of almost 10 times as many Argentines around Stanley would need rather a lot more troops. 5th Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Tony Wilson arrived at San Carlos at the end of May, accompanied by Major General Jeremy Moore, who would now take overall command of all British troops on the islands. 2 Para, which was at Goose Green following its successful offensive there, was attached to 5th Infantry Brigade, which was to be tasked with securing the southern approaches to Stanley, while Brigadier Julian Thompson's 3rd Commando Brigade consolidated their position to the north. Speed was of the essence, with winter closing in and Britain's logistical chain stretched to breaking point. At the start of June, Brigadier Wilson vaulted 2 Para forts to Fitzroy and Bluff Cove settlements by helicopter, after cursory reconnaissance revealed no Argentinians were present there. Moving the rest of 5th Brigade forwards was more of a challenge, as the continuing shortage of helicopters following the loss of conveyor forced the Welsh and Scots Guards to be transported to Bluff Cove by sea instead. Disaster struck at the end of this operation on June 8th, when the landing ship Sir Galahad was caught at Fitzroy by Argentinian Skyhawks, whilst it still had half of the Welsh Guards on board. 3 bombs exploded on the landing ship, which was crowded with soldiers waiting to disembark. 48 people died in the ensuing fireball, twice the number killed in the entire Goose Green operation, and Britain's worst single loss of life of the entire war. The hit on Galahad and the ensuing rescue operation delayed Britain's preparations for the attacks towards Stanley, which were drawing nearer. Despite the setbacks, by June 10th, Major General Moore had 7 battalions ready to advance on the Argentine stronghold around the island's capital. 3 Commando Brigades, 3 Para, 4-5 Commando and 4-2 Commando were on the front line, joined by the Scots Guards from the newly arrived 5th Brigade. At Fitzroy were 2 Para, the 1st Gurkhas and the Welsh Guards, who had been reinforced by 2 companies of 40 Commando to make up their losses suffered on Sir Galahad. The plan was for 2 back-to-back night attacks to seize all of the high ground west of Stanley, making it impossible for the Argentines to hold out in the town, whatever their numbers were. The British command was fully committed to this assault. In reserve were only 2 companies of 40 Commando at San Carlos and a single company of Gurkhas at Goose Green. Everything else the British had would go into the attack, and it would still be barely enough to match the Argentinians in numbers. By this stage in the conflict, Argentina had around 9,000 troops left in Stanley, of which around 5,000 or so were frontline combat units. Brigadier General Menendez, the Argentine commander in the Falklands, had positioned his units in naturally strong defensive positions in the hills west of Stanley, with 7th Regiment, 4th Regiment and 5th Marine Battalion in the front line. Further regiments continued to be retained near the coast to ward off any amphibious landings close to the capital. The Argentine regiments were battalion-sized units, roughly equivalent in size to the British units they would be facing, but stretched much more thinly across a wide area. To make matters worse, 5th Marine Battalion was the only Argentine unit that had proper cold weather gear and experience. 4th Regiment to their west had been drawn from the subtropical province of Corrientes near the Brazilian border, and so were profoundly unused to the conditions of a Falklands winter. Worried at how isolated and outgunned his troops were, General Menendez requested reinforcements on June 10th, but was refused. General Galtieri and the rest of the junta were not prepared to risk further naval or air force assets, so Menendez was ordered to fight to the end with what he had. The British attack began on the evening of June 11th, with 3 battalions moving forth to assault the 3 strong points of the outer ring of Argentine defences: Mount Harriet, 2 Sisters, and Mount Longdon. To the west, the offensive began smoothly, with both 4-2 Commando on Mount Harriet and 4-5 Commando on Two Sisters managing to overcome their opponents from 4th Regiment in a few hours of determined assault with relatively low casualties. Only a single man dead at Mount Harriet and 4 at Two Sisters. This was not the case at Mount Longdon, which was being assaulted by 3 para. Mount Longdon was smaller than the other hills attacked that night, but it was extremely rocky, with outcrops creating narrow channels dominated by Argentine machine guns that the paratroopers would have to advance through. Sure enough, not long into the attack, B Company became badly stuck on the western slopes. 4 Platoon was in particular danger, pinned down in the open by withering fire from the rocks above. The platoon's commanding officer was soon lost to injury, and its dire position was only alleviated when Sergeant Ian Mackay led a mad, nearly single-handed assault on 2 key Argentine positions. Both were put out of action, but Mackay was cut down in the process. He would receive a posthumous Victoria Cross for his gallantry. Mackay's sacrifice allowed his platoon to get into a better position on the hill, and B Company was able to steadily push the Argentine defenders under Major Carlos Salvador's back, eventually enabling A Company to sweep through their positions and clear the rest of Mount Longdon. It had been a brutal fight. 23 paras had been killed, 2 of them just 17 years old, and 35 wounded. At the end of this long, hard night of fighting, Argentina's defensive ring around Stanley had been severely dented. All 3 key hills had fallen, with severe casualties for the defenders, particularly on Mount Longdon, where the brutal close-quarters fight had caused heavy losses. The only consolation for Brigadier Menendez was that the fighting had taken longer than expected, delaying and disrupting the British enough that an additional day to regroup and prepare for the second phase of the offensive would be required. To carry it out, the Scots Guards and Gurkhas were brought up to prepare for their assault on Mounts Tumbledown and William, and artillery attacks on Argentine positions were stepped up, aided by spotting from newly captured vantage points.
Pixie, Mage, Knight, Rogue, Priest. Crystal Saga is back with a bang.
The final British offensive of the Falklands War began not long after sunset on June 13th, with the Scots Guards marching forward to begin the assault of Mount Tumbledown. There was some anxiety over this attack. Tumbledown had an almost sheer northern face, and its southern slopes were overlooked by Argentinian positions on Mount William, forcing the British into a direct assault from the west. To make matters worse, the defenders of Tumbledown were drawn from the 5th Marine Infantry Battalion, probably the best equipped and trained Argentine unit on the islands. Lieutenant Colonel Mike Scott tried to mitigate these risks by launching a diversionary assault south of Mount William prior to the main offensive, to try and draw the defenders' attention away. This worked well. G Company was able to capture the first third of Tumbledown without being detected. This easy success did not last for long though. When the left flank company took over the attack, it became pinned down by heavy Argentine fire in open ground on top of the ridge. It took several hours to get going again, eventually aided by a large artillery bombardment. Tumbledown was steadily secured, but the delay meant there was no time for the Gurkhas to attack Mount William before dawn. They would have to do it in daylight. At the same time as the Scots Guards were fighting their way up Tumbledown, to the north, 2 para were closing the ring around Stanley with an assault on Wireless Ridge. Unlike the other British battalion commanders, Lieutenant Colonel David Chandler decided on a noisy attack for this operation, with a large artillery bombardment beforehand and an overwhelming firepower used to secure his objectives. The paras were supported by a troop of Scorpion and Scimitar light tanks, as well as extensive artillery, mortar and naval gunfire support. All this firepower soon told, driving the Argentine defenders off the ridge and enabling the British to rain down a curtain of fire on an attempted counterattack under Major Roberto Bereze. With the loss of Wireless Ridge, the Argentine defence of Stanley had collapsed. Hundreds of troops streamed east into the town, pursued by British artillery. The Gurkhas were spared, or perhaps denied in their view, their uphill mountain assault in broad daylight when it was found that the trenches on Mount William were empty. Sensing that their opponents were routed, Brigadier Thompson ordered his battalions to keep advancing. 2 paras straight on the road into Stanley, and 4-5 Commando up to Sapper Hill, the last remaining bit of high ground still in Argentinian hands. The Welsh Guards were also moved forward, helicoptered onto the summit of Sapper Hill just as 4-5 Commando was arriving. As a result, Brigadier General Menendez realised on the morning of June 14th that the game was up. The British had him surrounded by land and sea, they had the high ground, and his troops were low on ammunition, organisation and morale. He concluded that the only course of action was to surrender, and despite General Galtieri's objections from Buenos Aires, that's exactly what he decided to do. Contact was made, a British negotiating team arrived that afternoon, terms were thrashed out, and then General Moore flew in that evening to sign an instrument of surrender with General Menendez. Moore then reported to London in the early hours, informing the British government that General Menendez surrendered to me all the Argentine armed forces in East and West Falkland. The Falkland Islands are once more under the government desired by their inhabitants. God save the Queen. In the 10 weeks between invasion and liberation, both sides suffered greatly. Britain lost 255 dead and 775 wounded. Argentina, 649 killed and 1,657 wounded. That's before you count the toll of PTSD and other mental health issues which many veterans on both sides have lived with for 4 decades. Thousands of Argentine prisoners of war were returned home just a few days after surrendering, and they found a nation in turmoil. General Galtieri had been deposed, the conclusion of 7 months of leadership during which he had got almost everything wrong. There was public anguish over the nation's defeat, attempts by the military to find scapegoats, and ultimately the beginning of a journey back towards democracy for Argentina. In the UK, the end of the Falklands War also had a profound effect on the government, but in the opposite direction. The task force returned home over the summer of 1982 in triumph. HMS Hermes and Canberra were met by huge cheering crowds on their arrival in port. Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government, which had been dreadfully unpopular only a year before, soared to new heights of popularity on the back of a quick, successful war. Victory in the Falklands contributed heavily to her landslide re-election in the 1983 general election and paved the way for the continued Thatcherite reshaping of Britain's economic and political institutions in the years to come. For the Falkland Islanders themselves, their belief in their Britishness and separateness from Argentina was, if anything, strengthened by the war. The islands remain, as they always have, a colony, ultimately dependent on Britain for its economy and security. But they are a colony under a government of their own choosing, thanks to a short but dramatic war in the South Atlantic 40 years ago. Hi everyone, thanks for watching this feature-length cut of the Falklands series that we produced last year for the 40th anniversary of the conflict. I think overall this is one of the best series that we have ever produced, so I wanted to make it available in this longer format with all the sponsorships from each episode cut out to give you the best viewing experience. I also want to say a really big thank you to all the patrons who supported the creation of these videos, all the videos
Hey, I need to launch a campaign in 2 weeks. Let's see. Okay, Elena?
What did you make?
What
did you make of some of the refereeing decisions?
It's just not good enough. Referees are just not good enough. Force officials are just not good enough. That's the bottom line. VAR today, I think did I see that right? That's 3 people at the VAR from South America in a match like this. I think so. I saw this before the match. I might be, but if this is what I saw, if this is correct, it's just VAR overturns.
Messi is a joke. For me, the best ever. That was tweeted in 2012.
What started as a football rivalry has turned into something much bigger. Across social media, people have stopped calling it England versus Argentina.
I just don't think Argentina are what they used to be 4 years ago and even before that. And I think it's England's best chance ever of getting to the final and winning the World Cup, I think.
Now it's England versus Argentina, while others have gone even further and labelled it England versus FIFA. After everything fans have watched over the past 2 weeks, it's easy to understand why those names have caught on.
Speaking of Argentina, this is the first time England have ever come up against a chap called Lionel Messi. Give us the goalkeeper's perspective on what makes him so dangerous.
Yeah, I think he's scored so many goals and he's contributed to so many goals as well over his career, and it's great to be able to finally come up against him for so long and watching him as a kid. And yeah, but we all know how good Messi is, but we also know how good Argentina is, so can't just solely rely on Messi. We've got to focus on the other strengths as well and the other weaknesses we can take advantage of.
On Wednesday night in Atlanta, the team many believe has benefited from the most controversial decisions of the tournament, faces the one opponent that could be impossible to push aside. This is the showdown the entire tournament has been leading toward, whether FIFA expected it or not. Before looking ahead, it's worth asking why that nickname spread so quickly, because it wasn't invented without a reason. It came from what people saw on the pitch.
Sí, que siempre empecé a jugar contra las selecciones grandes, no me pasó nunca contra Inglaterra, es la primera vez, así que va a ser un partido especial, semifinal de la Copa del Mundo, así que bueno, ahora descansaremos y nos prepararemos para eso. Venimos de mucho desgaste, de jugar una larga más otra vez y bueno, a veces se nota.
Argentina reached the semi-final by the narrowest of margins, and in several crucial moments, key decisions appeared to fall in their favour. Against Egypt, an outstanding Egyptian goal was ruled out after a review for a foul much earlier in the move.
This game against Argentina, Messi is going to be manoeuvring, around that right side to central areas a lot more than being on the left-hand side. And I feel like if you've got Spence in that position, I feel like one-on-one defender, there's not better than him out there, one-on-one.
While a strong penalty appeal at the opposite end was not reviewed before Argentina scored the winner, Egypt was so frustrated that they submitted a formal complaint to FIFA. Then, against Switzerland, just after the Swiss had equalised and the momentum had shifted, a VAR review upgraded an Argentine yellow card into a Swiss red card, changing the direction of the match. The debate only grew louder after Argentina's latest result.
He's never played England before. I need to say, and I think we may talk about it, these two teams hate each other in a way that makes the Yankees-Red Sox seem like a beautiful loving. He's never played them before. They hate each other so much they don't even play friendlies. They've not played since 2005. So the idea that Lionel Messi is not going to show up in Atlanta on Wednesday is unfathomable.
Even Argentina's coach, Lionel Scaloni, admitted afterward, luck was on our side today. That's the reality. Looking back even further, Messi also avoided a booking after a studs-up challenge on Algeria's captain that many viewers argued deserved a straight red. Time after time, close decisions seem to break in Argentina's favour. That run of controversial moments is why the Argentina nickname took off.
Does Argentina rely too heavily on Messi and France too heavily on Kylian Mbappé? It's just what it is. They're world-class players, and they do normally what they do. So everyone is pushing, and we had, I think, 3 different goal scorers in the first match, and to rely on Harry is just a natural thing because he loves the responsibility and he takes it. We rely on Harry because we can, because he's our forward, but we don't over-rely on him.
It also sparked the theory, now spreading across social media and football discussions. Some fans believe FIFA wants Messi to reach one more World Cup final. They point to the tournament's massive financial value, expected to generate billions of dollars, along with FIFA President Gianni Infantino's well-known admiration for Messi, including the decision to invite Inter Miami to the Club World Cup, despite the club not qualifying through the usual route. There is no confirmed evidence proving that claim. Still, many fans have looked at the sequence of officiating decisions, the financial stakes, and the public support for Messi, and decided those events are more than simple coincidence. That is why Wednesday's semi-final has become about far more than football in the eyes of many supporters.
I think they're infinitely beatable. I know they've got this elite footballer in the middle of the park that can sit there and do wonderful things. I still think that England have the ability to beat Argentina, irrespective of getting carried away and getting all up our own backsides about how important we are and he's coming over and all that old pony.
Right.
The bottom line is I think man for man, the Argentinians are infinitely beatable side.
Infinitely beatable.
Everything feels different now because the stage is much bigger. Up to this point, the claims about a so-called script, whether real or imagined, have followed matches against Cape Verde, Egypt, and Switzerland. They are respected teams, but they don't draw the same worldwide attention. This time, Argentina faces England, one of football's biggest names, backed by more than 15,000 travelling supporters and watched by millions across the globe. If a controversial red card, a razor-thin offside decision, or a debated penalty ends up shaping this match in Argentina's favour, it will be impossible to escape the spotlight. This won't be a game that quietly fades into the background. Every key moment from an England semi-final would be replayed, analysed frame by frame, by an audience that is already paying close attention and ready to debate every decision.
You know, everyone will talk about Messi because he's one of the goats of the game, but you can't look past how the ability and the talent we've got in the squad going forward, defensively, togetherness. We've got it all there, and that's what we need to put on show on Wednesday. But we also can't just talk about Messi. They're a good side and they're reigning champions. So yeah, they're a good side, but we've got so much ability in our squad going forward, and we're hard to break down. We've got that resilience, we've got that togetherness, and we've got that mentality. You know, that's what. Makes it a good team.
That is why many fans see this semi-final as more than just a football match. For some, it has become a test of confidence in FIFA and its officiating. Every whistle on Wednesday is likely to face intense scrutiny. Those expecting another controversial night will be watching for the same kinds of moments that have sparked debate throughout the tournament, starting with the possibility of an England goal being ruled out by the narrowest offside call. The biggest moments will be the ones everyone remembers. People will be watching for a harsh second yellow card that leaves England with 10 players just as the game swings their way. Others will be looking for a disputed penalty at one end, a strong appeal ignored at the other, or a sequence of decisions that seems to break in Argentina's favour. Those are the kinds of incidents that have already fueled debate throughout this tournament. If similar moments happen again on Wednesday, it's easy to see why social media would explode with reactions. Still, it's important to look beyond the simple story of heroes against villains, because the reality is more complicated than that. England have also benefited from controversial moments on their road to the semi-final. During the quarter-final against Norway, Jude Bellingham's equaliser came shortly after the ball appeared to brush an overhead camera cable. Some believe play should have been stopped if contact had occurred. FIFA's tracking system indicated there was no touch. The goal stood and Norway left frustrated. England coach Thomas Tuchel also admitted afterward, "We were lucky today." The conversation becomes more complicated once you look at the full picture. England also reached this semi-final with decisions that sparked debate. So this is not simply a story of one flawless team facing another surrounded by controversy. At the same time, many of the calls involving Argentina can be defended under the written laws of the game. Embolo was judged to have simulated, and the foul that cancelled Egypt's goal was still considered a foul under the rules, even if it happened much earlier in the move. A decision can follow the rulebook and still leave fans feeling it was unfair. That alone is not proof that matches are being manipulated. There is another side to this discussion as well. Roger Bennett, who attended the Egypt match in person, described the atmosphere as the most profound I have had in an American stadium. Near religious, joyous, with strangers hugging and Messi sobbing. Many viewers watching from home focused on the controversy, while those inside the stadium experienced something very different. A more likely explanation for many observers is inconsistent officiating, combined with the attention surrounding Messi's story, rather than a coordinated effort to influence results. No evidence has confirmed any match fixing, but FIFA's reputation has led many fans to question even its most defensible decisions. There is another reason this semi-final has so many people excited, and it has nothing to do with referees or online theories. England have shown throughout the tournament that they have enough quality to win this match on football alone. Thomas Tuchel has become only the 4th manager to guide England to a World Cup semi-final, joining Alf Ramsey, Bobby Robson and Gareth Southgate. His squad is led by 2 of the competition's standout performers. Harry Kane and Jude Bellingham have both scored 6 goals in 6 matches. Among the teams still left in the tournament, only Lionel Messi and Kylian Mbappe have matched or surpassed that total. But England's biggest strength goes well beyond the statistics. Kane regularly drops into deeper areas, pulling defenders out of position and linking attacks. That movement forces Argentina's defense into difficult choices before England attacks with speed from wide areas. Bukayo Saka, Anthony Gordon, Noni Madueke, Marcus Rashford and Eberechi Eze give England fresh energy on the wings, while Bellingham charges into the box from midfield at exactly the right moments. The system is designed to target the spaces Argentina have struggled to protect throughout the tournament. Whatever happens, this Argentina side has shown clear weaknesses, and England have the tools to take advantage of them. One area stands out whenever Argentina have been tested in this tournament. Their defense has been opened up by several opponents. Cape Verde created dangerous chances, Egypt produced one of the competition's most memorable goals, and Switzerland repeatedly found space behind the back line. Lionel Scaloni has even admitted his team has struggled to keep long spells of possession together. More than once, they have let winning positions become difficult. The physical toll is another major question. Argentina have already survived 2 matches that went to extra time and another dramatic knockout escape. That is a heavy workload, especially with 39-year-old Lionel Messi carrying so much responsibility. Against Switzerland, Messi did not score for the first time in 10 World Cup matches. If England can press aggressively and maintain a fast tempo, they have every reason to believe they can take control and shift the focus away from all the outside debate. At the same time, counting Argentina out would be a mistake. Few teams remaining can match their experience or composure in the biggest moments. Even when they have not played their best football, they have still found ways to survive. Much of that comes from having Lionel Messi and a group capable of producing a decisive moment without warning. Julian Alvarez delivered a stunning long-range strike against Switzerland, while Enzo Fernandez's header proved decisive against Egypt. When matches become tense and every chance matters, Argentina have repeatedly found a player ready to change the outcome. They are also driven by the emotion of a nation, hoping to see La Ultima de Leo, widely seen as Messi's final World Cup journey. Another fascinating storyline is about to unfold. Messi is set to face England for the first time in his career after missing their previous meeting because of suspension. Speaking to reporters, he said, "I've never had the chance to play against England. Argentina have also requested and received approval to wear their blue away kit, the same colour they wore in victories over England in 1986 and 1998. Many supporters place great importance on tradition and superstition. Some believe the blue shirt brings luck, while others see this tournament as one final opportunity for Messi to complete his World Cup story. Whether those beliefs matter or not,
surrender or die. Let me heal you. Want to
they have become part of the build-up surrounding this semi-final. From a tactical perspective, several key battles could decide the match. The biggest question is how England plans to deal with Messi. He no longer covers every part of the pitch like he once did, instead choosing his moments carefully and saving energy. Even so, he remains one of the most dangerous attacking players in the final third. England must decide whether to assign someone to follow him closely or rely on their defensive shape to contain him. Give Messi even a small opening, and he can make the difference. Argentina face an equally difficult challenge at the other end. How do they contain the partnership of Harry Kane and Jude Bellingham with a defence that has looked vulnerable? If they sit too deep, England can dominate possession and push forward. If they press higher, they risk leaving the spaces that Bellingham attacks so effectively. Small details could end up deciding everything in this semi-final. England believe they have the right matchup because Argentina face difficult choices in almost every area of the pitch. In midfield, the contrast is clear. Argentina rely on experience, control, and game management, while England bring intensity and fresh legs. The key question is whether Argentina can slow the tempo to their liking, or if England's energy will keep forcing the game forward. There is also an important storyline inside the England camp. After the win over Norway, Thomas Tuchel openly criticised his team's performance and admitted they had been fortunate. Jude Bellingham, who scored twice in that match, reportedly responded by questioning whether his manager understood what it was like to face players such as Erling Haaland and Martin Odegaard, a remark that drew attention because of Tuchel's limited playing career. Situations like that can either strengthen a squad or create unwanted distractions before a major match. England will want everyone focused before facing an experienced Argentina side that knows how to take advantage of any weakness. So how does this one play out? If both teams stay at full strength and the referees are not the main talking point, England have every reason to believe they can win. They look fresher, arrive in strong form, and match up well against an Argentina defense that has shown signs of vulnerability. Based on performances alone, England may have a slight edge. Even so, Argentina still have Messi, years of experience in high-pressure matches, and a remarkable ability to find a result even when they are far from their best. Everything surrounding this semi-final points to one question above all the rest. Some believe Argentina's success comes down to moments of brilliance, while critics argue key decisions have helped along the way. That debate has become almost as important as the football itself. More than any tactical battle, many fans are wondering whether the result will be decided entirely by what happens on the pitch. That uncertainty is a major reason this has become the most talked about match of the World Cup. The reward for the winner could hardly be bigger. Victory in Atlanta means a place in the World Cup final at MetLife Stadium on July 19 against either France or Spain, who meet in the other semi-final. For England, it would be their first appearance in a World Cup final since lifting the trophy in 1966, ending decades of near misses and disappointment. For Argentina, it would move Lionel Messi one step closer to finishing his World Cup career with back-to-back titles. An achievement many believe would strengthen his place in football history. With so much at stake, every refereeing decision is certain to face intense scrutiny. A single controversial moment could shape far more than one match. It could determine which football powerhouse gets the chance to compete for the trophy and which is left wondering what might have been. That responsibility will weigh heavily on the officials. Even without all the debates surrounding FIFA and refereeing, the history between England and Argentina would already make this one of the biggest matches in world football. Few World Cup rivalries carry as much history as England against Argentina. This will be their 6th meeting on football's biggest stage, but the first ever in a semi-final and their first clash of any kind in more than 20 years. The story stretches back to the robbery of the century in 1966, when Argentina captain Antonio Ratin was sent off at Wembley and famously refused to leave the field. Ratin passed away at the age of 89, with the news announced just hours before Argentina took the field wearing black armbands in his memory. The rivalry grew even more famous in 1986 at the Azteca Stadium. That match featured Diego Maradona's Hand of God goal and his remarkable solo run, later called the goal of the century, both coming in the same game. Played only 4 years after the Falklands War, the contest carried added emotion. Maradona later wrote that he almost preferred the handball because it felt a bit like stealing the wallet of the English. The history did not end there. England remembered David Beckham's red card in 1998 and his penalty redemption 4 years later in 2002. Nearly 6 decades of unforgettable moments have shaped this fixture, and Wednesday adds another major chapter with a place in the World Cup final on the line. The football rivalry has also long existed alongside the lasting shadow of the Falklands, or Las Malvinas as they are known in Argentina. The emotions behind this fixture reach far beyond football. The 1982 Falklands War, which lasted 74 days and claimed more than 900 lives, added a political and historical weight that has followed every England-Argentina meeting ever since. Many viewed the 1986 World Cup clash through that lens, helping explain why this rivalry still carries an intensity that goes well beyond the game itself. The atmosphere has already been building. After defeating Switzerland, Argentina's dressing room was filmed singing a chant that referenced the Falklands and declared they would win the trophy, por las Malvinas, por Diego, y por la última de Leo. Throughout the tournament, many Argentina supporters have also been heard singing El que no salta es un inglés. Meanwhile, more than 15,000 England fans have travelled to the United States, and reports have described minor confrontations between groups of supporters in Miami, with authorities preparing for large crowds before kickoff. Journalist Jonathan Wilson once offered a memorable description of Argentina's footballing identity, saying, "It comes from the streets where you learn to look after yourself because there's no teacher with a whistle." Many believe that competitive edge remains part of the team's character, and now it meets one of England's biggest World Cup tests. Everything now comes down to what happens on Wednesday. Either England produce the performance many believe they are capable of and remove any room for controversy, or another disputed match could intensify the already heated debate surrounding officiating and FIFA. One way or another, the football world will be watching every moment very closely. There is no quiet ending waiting for this one. Kickoff is at 3 Eastern in Atlanta, and everything about this match feels built for chaos, controversy, and a moment people will argue about for years. This is the game the entire tournament has been pushing us toward. So, what happens next? Do England finally break the curse and reach another World Cup final? Or does Messi's magic experience and maybe one more controversial moment carry Argentina through again? Drop your prediction in the comments before kickoff and tell me the exact score. Like the video, share it with another football fan, and subscribe to Machio so you do not miss the full breakdown after the final whistle. We will be back here going through every major moment and every disputed decision frame by frame. Peace.
Waiting.
係就係，但係咧，英格蘭都提到呢一點噶，都次次話咧有希望，次次對住咧阿根廷呢個咧球隊好燥啊！都因為燥就踢走咗，加上我成日講，我係講嗰啲對客講，英格蘭咧係一個唔錯嘅，就如果佢哋好似今日。咪就今個乜嘢啊？今個咪就上個 season 同埋今個世界盃嘅咪上個 Europe 嘅足球同埋今個乜嘢 season 嘅世界盃咧，就佢哋唔發嬲嚟講嘅啦，佢呢度就應該係會贏到呢個賽事㗎，就我都係咁講，但係咧就我同時間有好似32強，咪就同時間我係今年咧係咁樣諗㗎，平啊、法國同埋西班牙咧呢個乜嘢啊？呢個組隊咧係唔使擔心今年入唔到決，贏唔到國際盃，好似可以下年或者可以就話兼我支持嗰隊法國同埋乜嘢啊？西班牙呢一隊㗎啦，就唔使擔心，係 係擔心嗰個係英格蘭，佢哋就好似今年咁32強 ，OK， 就入咗16強啦。10強咧，其實我係覺得咧，好似有個疑問，一個疑問係失咗信心嘅疑問咯，即係話比賽下10強失咗信心嘅疑問咧就係、就入唔入到8強啊？就又入到喎，入到8強喎，就好似挪威對巴西咁，都係巴西贏嘅，就無端端挪威呢個球贏咗出去，英國我都有少少疑問，如果挪威呢一隊就對法國嚟，就巴西嚟講，咁樣踢走佢，就如果佢贏咗英格蘭嗰個係咯，如果挪威贏咗英格蘭嚟講咧，係今年係對阿根廷噶咯喎，所以對阿根嗰時對阿根廷呢個阿根廷咧，其實呢3隊係唔使擔心有個戰師係喺度嘅，第4位唔使擔心，係唔使擔心第4位，係擔心嘅咧，係擔心乜嘢咧？係頭3名嘅啫，就無端端係英格蘭嘅，無端端英格蘭入咗4強，就最後不過啦，就呢4隊就對住佢哋，佢4隊入咗啦，4強就鬥得激烈啦，就呢4隊。如果英格蘭咧又贏咗，如果幸運嚟講咧就贏咗阿根廷，你今年就啱啱喺上個節目阿根廷嘅前鋒退休啦，唔玩啦，就或者英格蘭又有機會又有機會上個咯喎，就大啲機會，好似四強嘅，就好似阿根廷嘅前嗰個咩事啊？就你嗰個唔知乜嘢啦，我講嗰個係咩事？係咁樣退休嚟講嘅咧，就好似巴西啊，法國啊、西班牙、德國啊，仲嗰啲對手嘅啦，有大機會呢嗰個世界盃。就係對我嚟講咧，就如果佢呢時退到休，就佢嗰個阿根廷嘅咧，係又要從頭嚟嘅個係個一個完美嘅足球團隊，但係佢哋係唔捱到，但係問題係幾長時間嘅咧，就大家都唔知邊個嚟，邊個走，咪就咩事就邊個會 踏入個一時嘅呢個地位咯。就問題係實在好對我嚟講咧，實在好冇，好冇差係差過跟住呢個人嘅太過遠啦。第三咧，我有少少唔開心咯。佢就發覺輸咗，就唔知邊隊就遲啲啦，就邊個打西班牙，邊個打法國咯。就最好邊個對西班牙，阿根廷對法國啦。希望對我嚟講，我梗係想法國贏㗎。而家微升啊，就你希望呢一個直播啦，就學到嗰啲歷史啦。第二，希望你哋中意呢個頻道啦，頻道啦，就因為做咗好多，我知，就我都唔知你哋會唔會中意嘅。我係呢個係唔同文化，唔同你哋分享嘅，我都對我自己意思嘅。好啦，就如果你哋未訂閱我嘅頻道咧，就希望你哋訂閱我嘅頻道啦。如果啱聽啱就俾個 like 俾我啦。就最緊要你哋學係呢一個影片嘅黃標都好，就最緊要你哋知道點解英國阿根廷受害。好啦，就麻煩晒。如果做咗嚟講，拜拜。